Helen Keller was an Alabama woman and a remarkable figure who became one of the most inspiring advocates for people with disabilities in American history. Helen Adams Keller, author, activist, and lecturer, was born in Tuscumbia, Alabama on June 27, 1880. She came from a comfortable family. She had a distinctive presence with her penetrating gaze and dignified bearing. Keller's early years were marked by both tragedy and extraordinary determination. She was born a healthy child with normal sight and hearing, but at 19 months old, she contracted an illness, possibly scarlet fever or meningitis, that left her both deaf and blind. This catastrophe transformed her world into one of darkness and silence, isolating her from normal human communication and development. Before her illness, young Helen had been a bright and precocious child, already beginning to speak. Afterward, she was trapped in a world she could not understand, unable to communicate her needs or feelings except through crude gestures and tantrums. Her frustration manifested in violent outbursts and uncontrollable behavior. The Keller family struggled to manage their daughter, uncertain how to reach her or educate her. Many people at the time believed that deaf-blind children were ineducable, destined to live out their lives in institutions. Helen's father, Arthur Keller, was a newspaper editor and former Confederate officer. Her mother, Kate Adams Keller, was considerably younger than her husband and was determined to find help for her daughter. When Helen was 6 years old, Kate read Charles Dickens's account of the education of Laura Bridgman, another deaf-blind child who had been taught to communicate. This gave the family hope that Helen might also be reached. The Kellers consulted Alexander Graham Bell, who was working with deaf children at the time. Bell suggested they contact the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston, which had educated Laura Bridgman decades earlier. The director of Perkins recommended a recent graduate, and Sullivan, as a teacher for Helen. This recommendation would change both their lives forever. And Sullivan arrived at the Keller home in Tuscumbia on March 3, 1887. Sullivan herself had overcome tremendous obstacles. She had been nearly blind as a child, had grown up in poverty in an almshouse, and had undergone multiple eye operations to restore partial vision. Her own struggles gave her insight into Helen's isolation and frustration. Sullivan was 20 years old, only 14 years older than her student, but she possessed remarkable determination and innovative teaching methods. The relationship between teacher and student began turbulently. Helen was undisciplined and wild, accustomed to getting her way through tantrums. Sullivan recognized that before education could begin, Helen needed to learn discipline and obedience. The first weeks were a battle of wills. Sullivan insisted on proper behavior at meals and basic manners, while Helen resisted fiercely. The family, sympathetic to their afflicted daughter, initially undermined Sullivan's authority. Sullivan convinced the Kellers to allow her to live alone with Helen in a small cottage on the property for 2 weeks. Away from her family's interference, Sullivan could establish her authority and begin systematic instruction. She used the manual alphabet, spelling words into Helen's hand, but initially Helen did not understand that the finger movements represented objects and concepts. She mimicked the signs without comprehension, treating them as a game rather than communication. The breakthrough came on April 5, 1887, a date Helen would later call her soul's birthday. Sullivan took Helen to the water pump in the yard and pumped water over one of Helen's hands while spelling water into the other. Suddenly, Helen understood. The finger movements were words. Words were things. Everything had a name, and she could learn them. The realization electrified her. She immediately demanded the names of other objects, learning 30 words that first day. The door to language and thought had opened, and Helen rushed through it with desperate hunger. Helen's progress after this breakthrough was phenomenal. She learned the manual alphabet with astonishing speed, then moved on to reading raised letters and eventually Braille. Sullivan taught her grammar, geography, arithmetic, and literature. More importantly, Sullivan gave Helen access to the world of ideas and imagination. She read to Helen constantly, spelling books into her hand hour after hour. Sullivan's dedication was total and exhausting, but she never wavered. By age 10, Helen had learned to speak, though her voice remained difficult to understand throughout her life. She learned by placing her fingers on Sullivan's lips and throat to feel the vibrations and positions that produced speech. It was a painstaking process that required incredible patience from both teacher and student. Helen also learned to lip read by touching people's lips as they spoke, though this method was imperfect and tiring. Helen's education became a national sensation. Newspapers reported on the miraculous deafblind girl who could communicate and learn. In 1888, Helen and Sullivan traveled to the Perkins Institute, where Helen met other blind children and continued her education. She became a celebrity, though this attention was not always beneficial. Questions arose about how much of Helen's learning was truly her own and how much was Sullivan's interpretation or even invention. The most serious controversy erupted in 1891 when Helen wrote a story called The Frost King that was discovered to be very similar to a published story called The Frost Fairies that had been read to her years earlier. Helen had no memory of hearing the earlier story and believed her tale was original. The incident raised questions about plagiarism and the nature of Helen's thought processes. An investigation by Perkins officials was traumatic for the 11-year-old Helen, though she was eventually exonerated of deliberate copying. The experience taught her caution and left lasting emotional scars. Despite this setback, Helen's education continued. Sullivan remained her constant companion and interpreter. In 1894, Helen enrolled at the Wright-Humason School for the Deaf in New York City to improve her speech and lip reading. She then attended the Cambridge School for Young Ladies to prepare for college. Her goal was to attend Radcliffe College, the women's coordinate institution of Harvard University. In 1900, Helen entered Radcliffe College. It was an unprecedented achievement for a deafblind person. Sullivan attended every class with her, spelling lectures and reading materials into Helen's hand. The academic workload was crushing for both of them. Helen had to read all her books in Braille or have them spelled to her manually. Few textbooks were available in Braille, so Sullivan spent hours transcribing materials. Despite these obstacles, Helen excelled academically. While at Radcliffe, Helen began writing her autobiography with the help of her English instructor and later editor, John Macy. The Story of My Life was published in 1903 while Helen was still in college. The book was a critical and commercial success, bringing Helen's experiences to a wide audience. Her writing was praised for its clarity, insight, and literary quality. Some critics questioned how much was Helen's own work versus her teacher's contributions, but the book established Helen as an author in her own right. Helen graduated from Radcliffe College in 1904 with a Bachelor of Arts degree, cum laude. She was the first deafblind person to earn a college degree. The achievement was celebrated nationally and internationally. Helen had proven that deafblind individuals could achieve at the highest academic levels given proper support and education. Her success challenged prevailing assumptions about disability and human potential. After college, Helen needed to support herself and Sullivan financially. The Keller family fortune had declined, and Sullivan had no independent means. Helen turned to writing and lecturing. She published articles and books on various subjects, including her experiences, social issues, and political causes. Her writing income was supplemented by donations from wealthy supporters who admired her achievements. In 1905, Sullivan married John Macy, Helen's former editor. The three lived together in an arrangement that was sometimes tense but generally functional. Macy helped manage Helen's literary career and supported both women financially. However, the marriage was troubled from the start. Macy was a socialist intellectual whose political views influenced Helen's thinking. The marriage eventually failed, and Macy left in 1914, though he and Sullivan never formally divorced. Helen's political awakening occurred during these years. Influenced by Macy and her own observations of social inequality, Helen became a socialist and a supporter of radical causes. She joined the Socialist Party in 1909 and the Industrial Workers of the World. She wrote articles advocating for workers' rights, women's suffrage, and birth control. She opposed World War I as a capitalist venture. Her political activism shocked many of her conservative supporters and admirers. The press and public had difficulty reconciling Helen the inspirational symbol with Helen the radical activist. When she wrote about overcoming disability, her words were celebrated. When she wrote about class struggle and socialism, critics dismissed her views as the product of manipulation by her teachers or advisors. they could not accept that a deafblind woman might develop her own political philosophy. This patronizing attitude frustrated Helen throughout her life. In 1914, Helen's political radicalism reached its peak. She wrote articles supporting strikers and criticizing capitalism. However, as World War I intensified, and especially after the United States entered the war in 1917, Helen's radical phase moderated. She supported the war effort and focused more on disability rights and less on revolutionary politics. She never abandoned her progressive views, but she expressed them more carefully. During the 1910s, Helen and Sullivan struggled financially. Helen's writing income was irregular, and her political views had alienated some wealthy donors. In 1914, they attempted to raise money through a vaudeville act. Helen would appear on stage, give a short speech, answer questions from the audience, and demonstrate her communication methods. The act was initially controversial. Critics thought it demeaned Helen to appear in vaudeville alongside jugglers and comedians. However, the performances were successful and lucrative, and they continued intermittently for several years. In 1924, Helen began her association with the American Foundation for the Blind, which would define much of her later life. She became a spokesperson and fundraiser for the organization, traveling across the country giving speeches and raising awareness about blindness. This work suited her talents and gave her a clear purpose. She advocated for better education for blind children, employment opportunities for blind adults, and prevention of blindness through public health measures. Helen's work with the American Foundation for the Blind was tremendously successful. She was a compelling speaker despite her unusual voice. Audiences were moved by her presence and her message. She raised substantial funds for services for the blind and influenced public policy. She lobbied Congress for legislation supporting blind people and met with presidents and other political leaders. Her fame gave her access to power, and she used it effectively to advance her causes. In 1932, Sullivan's health began to decline seriously. Her eyesight, never good, was failing completely. She was also suffering from other ailments. A young woman named Polly Thompson, who had joined the household in 1914 as a secretary, gradually took over Sullivan's role as Helen's companion and interpreter. This transition was difficult for everyone, especially Helen, who had depended on Sullivan for nearly 50 years. And Sullivan died on October 20, 1936. Helen was devastated by the loss of her teacher, companion, and closest friend. Sullivan had been the person who gave Helen language and opened the world to her. Their relationship had been intense, sometimes difficult, but utterly central to both their lives. Helen mourned deeply but eventually found the strength to continue her work with Thompson's support. During World War II, Helen visited wounded soldiers in military hospitals. She had a special connection with blinded veterans, offering them hope and practical advice about adjusting to blindness. Her visits were considered highly valuable for morale. She also continued her fundraising work for the American Foundation for the Blind, which saw increased need during and after the war. After the war, Helen embarked on international tours on behalf of the American Foundation for Overseas Blind. Between 1946 and 1957, she visited 35 countries on 5 continents. She met with world leaders, addressed parliaments, and inspired millions of people with disabilities around the world. In Japan, she was particularly beloved, visiting multiple times and profoundly influencing Japanese attitudes toward disability. Her international work spread American methods of blind education and rehabilitation globally. Helen received numerous honors and awards throughout her later life. She was awarded honorary degrees from universities around the world. She received the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 1964. She met every president from Grover Cleveland to John F. Kennedy. She was friends with Mark Twain, Alexander Graham Bell, and Eleanor Roosevelt. Her fame and influence extended far beyond the disability community. Helen's later writings included Let Us Have Faith in 1940, Teacher, and Sullivan Macy in 1955, and numerous articles and essays. Teacher was her tribute to Sullivan, published nearly 20 years after Sullivan's death. The book revealed the depth of their relationship and Helen's enduring gratitude to the woman who had given her language and life. Helen's writing remained clear and thoughtful, covering subjects from religion to politics to personal reflection. Polly Thompson died in 1960, leaving Helen without her longtime companion and interpreter. Helen was 80 years old and increasingly frail. She retired from public life and lived quietly at her home in Westport, Connecticut, called Arkan Ridge. She was cared for by nurses and companions during her final years. She remained mentally alert but physically weak, suffering from a series of small strokes. Helen Keller died in her sleep on June 1, 1968, at Arkan Ridge. She was 87 years old. Her death marked the end of an extraordinary life that had spanned nearly a century and had touched millions of people. Her funeral service was held at the National Cathedral in Washington, and her ashes were placed there next to those of Sullivan and Polly Thompson, the two women who had been her companions through life. Helen's legacy is vast and multifaceted. She proved that deaf-blind people could learn, achieve, and contribute to society. She advanced the cause of disability rights and influenced education methods for people with sensory impairments. She raised awareness about blindness prevention and treatment. She inspired countless individuals with disabilities to pursue education and independence. Her life demonstrated the power of dedicated teaching and the resilience of the human spirit. However, Helen's legacy is also complicated. She became a symbol, sometimes against her will, and symbols can obscure the complex reality of the person. The inspirational narrative of Helen overcoming her disabilities has sometimes been used to suggest that any disabled person who does not achieve similar success simply has not tried hard enough. This interpretation ignores the exceptional circumstances of Helen's life, including her family's resources, Sullivan's extraordinary dedication, and Helen's own exceptional intelligence and determination. Modern disability activists have a complex relationship with Helen's legacy. They honor her achievements and her advocacy work while critiquing the superscript narrative that surrounds her story. They note that Helen's success depended on intensive one-on-one support that few disabled people receive. They point out that celebrating exceptional individuals can deflect attention from the systematic barriers that most disabled people face. They argue that accessibility and inclusion should not depend on disabled people proving themselves extraordinary. Helen's own views on disability evolved throughout her life. In her early years, she sometimes wrote about blindness and deafness in tragic terms, describing them as afflictions to be overcome. Later, she developed a more nuanced understanding, recognizing disability as a social condition as much as a physical one. She advocated for changing society's attitudes and removing barriers rather than simply expecting disabled people to adapt to an inaccessible world. This evolution in her thinking anticipated modern disability rights philosophy. Throughout her life, Helen remained deeply spiritual. She was influenced by Swedenborgianism, a Christian mystical tradition that emphasized inner spiritual sight over physical vision. This faith gave her comfort and framework for understanding her experiences. She wrote extensively about religion and faith, seeing spiritual insight as more valuable than physical sight or hearing. Her religious writings were sincere and thoughtful, though less widely read than her autobiographical works. Helen never married and had no children. Her closest relationships were with Sullivan and Polly Thompson. There were rumors of romantic attachments, including to Peter Fagan, a young socialist who worked as her secretary in 1916. They apparently planned to elope, but Helen's family discovered the plan and prevented it. The incident was hushed up and Helen never publicly discussed it. Whether she felt the loss of romantic love and family life is unclear from her public statements, though she wrote movingly about loneliness and the human need for connection. In assessing Helen Keller's life, one must acknowledge both her remarkable achievements and the unique circumstances that made them possible. She was extraordinarily intelligent and determined, but she also had advantages many disabled people lack: family resources, access to excellent education, devoted teachers, and eventually fame that brought opportunities. Her success should inspire but not set an impossible standard for others. Helen Keller represents the possibility of human achievement against enormous odds. She proved that sensory disabilities need not prevent intellectual development or social contribution. She used her fame to advocate for others and to promote social justice. She lived a full life despite obstacles that would have defeated most people. Her courage, curiosity, and commitment to learning remained constant from that moment at the water pump when she discovered language until her death more than 80 years later. Perhaps the most important aspect of Helen's legacy is her insistence on the humanity and potential of people with disabilities. In an era when disabled people were often institutionalized and hidden away, Helen demonstrated publicly and repeatedly that disability did not diminish human worth or capability. She demanded to be treated as a full person, not a curiosity or an object of pity. This assertion of dignity and equality laid groundwork for the disability rights movement that would emerge after her death. In the end, Helen Keller was neither a saint nor simply a symbol, but a complex human being who lived an extraordinary life. Her legacy includes her advocacy work, her writing, and her example of perseverance and achievement. She is remembered today for transcending her disabilities and for her lifelong commitment to helping others do the same. She remains an inspiration not because she was perfect, but because she was fully human, facing her challenges with courage, intelligence, and an unquenchable desire to connect with the world around her.